Before we get to the witnesses today, I would just like to note that we've been starting our meetings late quite regularly, and I really want that to end today, of course, because of the committee that was here before. It's understandable, but from now on, I really want the meeting started on time and end them on time. And I'll start today by ending this meeting at 1 o'clock sharp, because it's not fair when people have to leave to get to the next meeting and our meeting is extended. So I encourage everyone to be here on time next time. I will start as long as we have 3 members, which is all we need to hear witnesses, and you know, try to, or in fact do stick to the timelines that have been laid out for the committee. So I will now get to the business of the meeting today, which of course is a continuation of our study on Canada-U.S. trade. We're dealing with investment issues and other trade issues, including the Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America. And we have as our witnesses today from the Canadian Labour Congress, Teresa Healy, Senior Researcher. From the Canadian Trucking Alliance, David Bradley, Chief Executive Officer, and Ron Lennox, Vice President, Trade and Security. From the Quebec Network of Continental Integration, Norman Pepin, Director, Research Services, and Nancy Burrows, Coordinator. And from Carleton University, Michael Hart, the Simon Reisman Professor of Trade Policy, the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs. So we will start in the order. The witnesses are listed on the order paper on the agenda. We'll start from the Canadian Labour Congress with Teresa Healy. And I will just kind of ask you, in fact, I would insist that you stick to the 8 minutes that have been allocated, and I also will cut off the presentations if they go beyond that any significant amount. So please go ahead, Ms. Healy.
Good morning. I would like to thank you for this invitation to appear today. The Canadian Labour Congress represents 3.2 million workers across Canada. We live and work in every single community in this country and have expertise as workers on every single economic sector as well. In the labour movement, we are concerned for the well-being of our members and their families, of course, but our concern is broader than that. We organize ourselves by a principle of solidarity, and solidarity has brought us directly into the political realm to fight for public health care and other public services, for equality for women, for dignified work and a welcoming society for immigrants, for good jobs and a just economic policy here in Canada. And we also work to see that our government represents us in creating a just international order. Last week, we were horrified to hear of the death of 2 Chinese workers at an oil sands project in Alberta. Migrant workers facing the most precarious working and living conditions in the country also face dangerous work and are vulnerable to abuse in many forms. In solidarity with organized and unorganized workers across the country, the CLC appears before you today to ask you to consider very carefully the implications of the so-called Security and Prosperity Partnership. We ask you to candidly assess this initiative by answering the question, security and prosperity for whom? As social activists, we in the labour movement usually have our eyes on the laws that are proposed, passed, reformed, or defeated in our respective legislatures. What the SPP reveals is that the government executives in North America are willing to cooperate to avoid legislative and public challenge. Democratic debate and decision-making is making way for privileged corporate access and new rules that undermine sovereignty and human rights. The SPP, like NAFTA before it, is partially about trade, but more fundamentally, it is about changing the role of the state in relation to investment. It has allowed private investors to continue to push for privatization of public services and an expanded role of the market into the public economy. The creation of an integrated and increasingly privatized North American economic bloc is intended to strengthen the position of North American corporations in world order under the economic and security umbrella of the United States. Our relationship with the United States is certainly about trade. Many of our members depend upon jobs in the traded sector of the economy. We miss an important lesson, however, if we think about economic integration in North America only in terms of trade flows. The big idea, the so-called big idea of negotiations leading to a broader trade and investment treaty has fallen out of favor. Rather, in the context of widespread opposition within civil society and among progressive political parties, proponents of ongoing liberalization have moved underground to promote what is known as deeper integration across North America. Some define deep integration as coordinated actions by governments intended to eliminate regulations and open up service markets to foreign competition. Others simply call it NAFTA plus. At its core, the idea is that the more governments harmonize regulations across borders, the deeper economic integration has been achieved. As the Minister of Industry Canada said recently, he is working, quote, to ensure that Canada and U.S. regulations are harmonized, end quote. Where this is not possible, Minister Bernier stated, the government will work with industry to recognize regulatory differences and ensure, quote, an attempt be made to soften them, end quote. The agenda of regulatory reform tells us that the NAFTA did not bring absolute free trade into being. There are still ways in which market regulations are subjected to restraint by society. From a neoliberal point of view, this must be changed, political opposition notwithstanding. The SPP agenda tells us that the reforms should diminish environmental regulations, speed up food safety and drug approvals, loosen occupational health and safety requirements, and facilitate the rapid production, export, and consumption of energy resources. Regulatory reform is also meant to impose corporate-defined benchmarks as, quote, best government practices, end quote, to govern the provision of public services. The SPP is about increasing the power of corporations and ongoing deregulation. However, the current project of regulatory reform is also meant to impose a new layer of regulations on workers, citizens, and residents of North America, framed with an anti-terrorism justification. In this sense, then, deep integration is also about re-regulation and a much stronger role for the state. Since 9/11, Canadian investors with powerful economic interests in closer integration with the United States have refocused their efforts, but now have cloaked them in the language of national security. Regulatory reform appears at one level to be a rather mundane and routine area of public policy making, which simply deals with what makes sense. However, it is anything but that. The SPP is not a signed treaty and has never been brought before the legislatures of North America for discussion and review. It is driven by the executive levels of government in consultation with the business community, but excludes the legislatures and parliamentary oversight. It is a process that depends upon working groups within the public service of all three countries, but excludes public consultation. The CEOs, however, have unfettered access to this process. While I could go on at length to talk about the U.S. energy security agenda, I won't do that right now, nor will I talk about the hyper-development of the tar sands, which is something that I could speak about, but this is something that you might want to refer to in my brief that I've submitted to the committee. What I would like to comment on in the last minute that I have here is that we're very concerned about the increased harmonization of Canadian and U.S. customs and immigration policies in respect of the security agenda. The SPP provides for an ongoing process of negotiation on the terms of expanded border surveillance infrastructure. Elements of a common trade and security perimeter are being introduced with implications for sovereignty. And on the security front, advances are also extremely worrisome in terms of civil liberties. We need to understand this aspect of the SPP in relation to the impact of workers, especially workers of color. What are the mechanisms within the SPP to evaluate the relationship between security cooperation and human rights? Who is monitoring the effects of the new security regime on workers of color and racialized immigrants, as well as migrant workers? And finally, I'd like to conclude by saying that the great tragedy of this new cooperative dynamic between Canada, the United States, and Mexico is that it does nothing to address the most pressing issues of our day. Given the many ways in which governments in North America could cooperate to increase social equality, it's very clear that these areas are not being addressed by this agenda. Since the Second World War, the United States has drawn Canada ever closer to itself. Canadians, however, have stubbornly taken their leaders to task in the great debate over whether governments should promote an east-west or a north-south economic orientation. Indeed, Canadians and their social movements and their political parties, in many respects, have worked hard to reveal the interests of capitalists hidden behind the invisible hand of the free market. Over the past 5 years, the institutional racism exerted by the iron fist of the security regime has been revealed as well. So we call for full public hearings and a vote in Parliament on the SPP. We call for an abolishment of the North American Competitiveness Council. We would like to see review and study of the implications of the further security cooperation with the United States on workers, especially on immigrant workers. We call for the government to abandon any regulatory agenda that leads to the hyperdevelopment of the tar sands. We call for the government to abandon any regulatory reform agenda that leads to the downward harmonization of standards. We call for, finally, a process that is open, transparent, and accountable, leading to a North American relationship built on democracy, human rights, and sovereignty.
Thank you, Ms. Healy. We will go now to our witness from the Canadian Trucking Alliance. I understand that Mr. Bradley couldn't be here today, so Mr. Lennox, please go ahead for 8 minutes.
Thank you very much. First of all, David offers his regrets. He's been ill for the last couple of weeks. He had planned to be here until as late as last night, but unfortunately he just couldn't make it. He's asked me to read the following statement on his behalf. Let me begin by thanking the committee for the opportunity to appear this morning. I'll address some specific issues regarding the Security and Prosperity Partnership and the North American Competitiveness Council in a few minutes. But let me begin by giving you a trucking industry perspective on trade in the Canada-United States border. No doubt everyone today recalls the scene back in mid-September 2001. Trucks were backed up for miles waiting to cross into the United States. Despite the frustration and confusion that reigned during those days, people, truck drivers especially, understood that we were dealing with an unprecedented situation. The U.S. had been attacked, and its government reacted as its citizens would expect, by subordinating everything to national security. As difficult as it was, everyone knew that the border backlogs would eventually be cleared. Now, almost 6 years on, border delays can still happen at any time, but they are not a feature of the nightly news, and the lineups, when they do occur, are generally shorter. But no one should have the illusion that all is well at the border. There is no room for complacency. To a great extent, the current situation reflects the fact that Canadian exports of manufactured goods to the United States are soft. Both car and truck traffic are down. The reality is that the border continues to thicken, and this is a threat to our economic well-being. In some respects, the situation immediately post 9/11 was easier to deal with than today. The Canada-U.S. Smart Border Declaration of December 2001 was the result of a great sense of urgency and purpose by the two national governments. Improved security and trade facilitation was the goal repeated at every conference, at every meeting, in every speech, and in every interview by politicians and government officials. It made sense then, and it still does now, but are we on the road to achieving that balance? Regrettably, from where I sit, listening daily to the folks who work in the trucking industry and who move 2/3 of Canada-U.S. trade, I have to respond no. Despite the lofty intentions of the two governments, the border is increasingly bogged down in a seemingly endless stream of costly and often redundant security measures and fees, mostly emanating from the U.S. Some may tell me to be patient, that at just over 5 years we are still in the midst of a transition from the old way to the modern border, where data moves electronically, trucks are processed efficiently, and border officials are able to surgically target those who may do us harm. No doubt there is some element of that going on. The border is becoming more automated, and done right by eliminating paper and the need for physical inspection, this should help speed things up over time. There's still hope that risk assessment programs like free and secure trade will one day reach their full potential. But the flip side, and the one that I hear most often, is not so optimistic. Over the past 5 years, those involved in cross-border trade, but particularly the truckers, have had to restructure their operations to respond to at least a dozen major U.S. security initiatives. Trucking companies in the thousands have adopted supply chain security programs and have invested in expensive information systems enhancements or outsourcing arrangements to meet strict prior notice requirements. CTA has estimated that the cost to the trucking industry alone, just to cross the border into the U.S., which inevitably end up being passed on to our customers, is about $500 million per year. Yet even if a company has done everything possible to secure its business, should one individual, say a truck driver, be apprehended for smuggling drugs into the United States, the company he works for will see its CPAC and FAST designations automatically canceled pending a review, which can stretch to several months, putting that company's transborder business in jeopardy. Initially, companies were encouraged to promote and market CPAC and the FAST program as a way to generate business. But it has also been suggested to us that carriers should be wary about promoting their CPAC status too broadly, lest they become targets for smugglers. There's also an important personal dimension. Border security was supposed to be all about keeping the bad guys, the terrorists, out. The rest of us, the other 99.99%, were supposed to be able to continue to travel and trade with a minimum of aggravation. It hasn't turned out that way. Our drivers face the prospect of multiple background security checks, sometimes for different programs within the same department. Truck drivers have been berated and fined for packing roast beef sandwiches and oranges in their lunch bags. The slightest administrative error and they can be held up for hours. In the worst case, they can lose their FAST card and have little chance of getting it back. It would be easy to blame the border inspectors, the folks on the front lines. No doubt they do take the brunt of the criticism. And yes, on any given day, some people will say and do some dumb things or take themselves a little bit too seriously. But let there be no confusion. No one gets promoted for getting more trucks across the border. The real responsibility lies with those sequestered far from the border in our nation's capitals. It is there where I believe perspective needs to be regained. Lawmakers and public officials seem to be able to roll out new programs and requirements at will. This spring, for example, single crossing U.S. customs fees for trucks were increased. New U.S. agricultural quarantine inspection fees will be imposed June 1st on all trucks crossing the border regardless of what they're hauling, even though the agency responsible freely acknowledges that between 80 and 95% of the trucks entering the United States don't even move the commodities of interest. Yet another redundant, duplicative, and expensive transportation worker identity card is being introduced this year, initially at U.S. seaports, but eventually at all transport facilities. Truck drivers who have already been security screened under the Free and Secure Trade program will need one of these cards regardless, at a cost of $100 or more. And I'm sure everyone here is aware of the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative. It has been cast as a tourism issue, but make no mistake, if problems are incurred in getting the right credentials into the hands of truck drivers, or if there are significant backups in non-commercial traffic that will spill over into the commercial lanes, it will very quickly become a trade issue as well. Since 9/11, 3 major initiatives have been rolled out in an attempt to cope with this dilemma of how to make the border more secure without choking legitimate traffic and trade. First, there was the Smart Border Declaration, then the Security and Prosperity Partnership, and most recently, the North American Competitiveness Council. Well, CTA has been engaged in all 3 exercises and saw in each the opportunity to push through some much-needed reforms. I'm beginning to question whether we have lost focus and whether the focus and urgency that characterized the Smart Border Declaration, which was being driven in this country by a small focus team in the Privy Council office, has been similarly diffused. Make no mistake, the Canadian Trucking Alliance expressed support for SPP when it was first announced. But I have to be blunt in stating that I am underwhelmed by its impact to date. At its initial incarnation, we were told that the SPP was to deal with the low-hanging fruit, those issues that individually might not appear to add up to much, but in combination would have a positive impact on the border. And initially there was some progress. I point to the 25% solution to increase throughput at Ontario-Michigan border crossings as a useful exercise. Other initiatives in progress also hold promise, most notably the commitment to harmonize automated systems that are used to transmit and receive information from U.S. and Canada customs. However, I can't help but note that one of the most important SPP initiatives as far as the trucking industry is concerned, something that had its genesis in the Smart Border Declaration, was shot down last week when the U.S. Department of Homeland Security said it was officially backing away from a commitment to pilot reverse inspection at 2 Ontario-New York border crossings, the principal one being at Buffalo-Fort Erie. This was a positive initiative with support not only from traders on both sides of the border, but from the local communities themselves. No one ever said that reverse inspections would work everywhere, but they did hold promise at Peace Bridge. If agreements to conduct pilots of potential solutions can be unilaterally shelved, what confidence can we have in other agreements and declarations? One other example. A seemingly innocuous initiative under the Prosperity banner would have seen a streamlining of the process by which Canadian carriers file proof of insurance in the United States. But what has happened? The issue has been thrown into the formal rulemaking process. Earlier this year, CTA and others filed comments in response to an advance rulemaking notice. Sometime in the future, there'll be a formal rulemaking proposal, and maybe, eventually, there'll be a final rule that will make things better for Canadian carriers. I don't believe this is what the formulators of SPP had in mind. It's probably too early to reach any conclusions about the North American Competitiveness Council. It has served to once again raise the profile of border issues to a certain degree and make some recommendations on issues of concern to trucking, such as the agricultural fee issue I referred to earlier. But whether it can or will ultimately be a mechanism for effectively dealing with the kinds of issues truckers deal with on a daily basis, or to regain the kind of momentum initially generated by the Smart Border Declaration, remains to be seen. I would also like to add that, in our opinion, our own government needs to be better organized and less diffuse in its approach to border issues. This is our economic reality as an export-driven economy and the other partner in the world's largest bilateral trading relationship. Thank you very much for the opportunity to appear here this morning, and I'd be pleased to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lennox, for your presentation. We'll go now to the Quebec Network on Continental Integration, and we have 2 witnesses today, Monsieur Pepin and Ms. Burrows. I don't know, either one or both of you can make a presentation up to 8 minutes. Go ahead.
Je vais commencer la présentation.
Well, I'll start the presentation, and then Nancy will pick up. The QNCI is a multi-sectoral coalition in Quebec that represents unions, community groups, grassroots associations, students, environmental groups, women's groups, and we represent over 1 million people in Quebec. Today you have in front of you representatives from the CSD at the QNCI, and Nancy, who represents the Quebec Federation of Women at our network. Now, first of all, I wanted to thank the committee for extending its hearings beyond what was initially scheduled, where you planned to hear just from various departments and some business people. Well, this is an excellent initiative, but it still won't be sufficient, and I want to point that out right from the beginning. Now, these hearings, as important as they are, will not make it possible to reach out to all parliamentarians, because you're, about 15 around the table, nor will it allow us to reach out to the entire population. And these are people who must be kept abreast of what is being negotiated on their behalf by a limited group of members of the executive branch of government, the Prime Minister, the Ministers of Industry, Foreign Affairs, Public Safety, and by a limited group of business sector leaders. We consider the SPP an important issue that must be the subject of a broadened debate and a vote in the House of Commons. The government can't not hide behind the fact that it's a treaty that's been duly signed by 3 countries. It's been done behind the scenes, and issues are not revealed unless there are ATI requests. We're told that it's simply a matter of discussing and resolving technical issues that are barriers to trade. Now, we would all like to think, or people are trying to lead us to believe, that it's just an issue of harmonizing the format for tin cans. But in fact, these are huge issues among the three countries. We're talking about bulk exports of water and quintupling oil production in the oil sands in Alberta. Now, even if it were just about harmonizing tin cans, is it fair that some companies using the standard measure will be a step ahead of those people who are not using the same format for their tin cans? When the first report was tabled by the business leaders on the state of advancement of the SPP, 3 years after the partnership was signed, our concerns were confirmed in that we learned that teams had been working for a long time prior to the initial announcement, and they didn't shed much light on the partnership. It was at that time that we discovered that 19 working groups had been created, 9 for security and 10 for prosperity, and that they are in charge of moving forward with some 317 deliverable objectives. And in June 2005, with the initial report, we learned that the timeline for some of these deliverables had already passed. They were already complete. With the tabling of the second report, there were some 65 deliverables involved. So as you can see, the SPP is moving ahead at high speed. And no one's aware of it except to business leaders. The SPP implements a new mechanism by which the private sector takes control of decisions. The largest corporations in the three countries are party to the negotiations and have direct access. They're defining the objectives and means to put in place by the executive branches of the three governments, and are responsible for putting in place specific economic policies and amending certain regulations. This approach must be avoided at all costs because it's considered by the business community as leading nowhere, according to what they've said, unless there is a debate with respect to changing existing legislation. So I'd like to point out that with the creation of the NACC in June of 2006, which represents the 30 largest corporations in North America, to advise heads of states on competitiveness in North America. It's important to point out that the 10 members of the NACC were appointed by Prime Minister Harper in June 2006. They're all members of the BCNE, which represents the CEOs of the 150 largest corporations in Canada. This isn't surprising. It's also this association that is taking charge of the Secretariat for the Canadian section at the NACC. To illustrate the role played by the business community in this area, we simply need to look to a statement made by Carlos Guterres at a meeting of the NACC on June 15th in Washington. The purpose of this meeting was to institutionalize the SPP and the NACC. The purpose was to institutionalize this, and a little later on, the representative Ron Covey from Lockheed Martin, and who's president of the American section of the NACC, stated to Maclean's that the ministers are asking us or telling us what to do. You have tell us what you want to do, and what you want us to do, and we'll ensure that it's done. And in the presentation, you'll see there's a list of the members of the NACC. Now, since when should business communities be solely responsible for these issues of security and prosperity? Now let's talk about security. One of the main worrisome aspects of the SPP is that it links security to economic prosperity. The most powerful country on the continent, the United States, has embarked upon a war on terrorism where national security trumps citizens' rights. It's also become a pretext for increasing control over individuals. In this context, harmonizing Canadian policies with those of its neighbor to the south is particularly worrisome with respect to respecting human rights. Following 9/11, we had, as you will recall, anti-terrorism legislation, C-36, and the sharing of lists monitoring terrorists with its major failures, as we saw in the case of Mayor Arar. Now we're talking about putting in place security measures that are compatible for immigration and integrated police forces at our borders. Canada, like Mexico, is in a situation where it has to adapt its adapt to these security threats against another country by abandoning and giving up part of our sovereignty without even being in a position to verify the content of these threats. We don't want to be forced to toe the U.S. line. We want to maintain our ability to define our rules based on our own societal choices. Now, I know that you've heard from comments from the others on natural resources, etc., but I'd like to go to the issue of the oil sands. We know that the U.S. has a great need for oil. They're always looking for more stable countries and suppliers than its traditional suppliers. With the abundance of oil sands in northern Alberta, Canada is the best place for them to obtain additional supply. The Canadian Department of Natural Resources and the Department of Energy in the United States sponsored a meeting in Houston, Texas on the 24th and 25th of January 2006. Participants at this meeting were the major oil CEOs from the United States and representatives from the oil sands. They were representatives from the government of the United States, Canada, and Alberta. The meeting took place literally the day after the Conservatives, Stephen Harper's Conservative government was elected. That was on the 23rd of January. But none of the people represented at the table were elected. Who did these senior officials get their mandate from? Because Paul Martin's government had just lost the elections and Stephen Harper's government had not yet been sworn in. The discussions were far from being purely technical, as we often hear the government say. We learned through the report on the Houston meeting that it was the issue was accelerating the pace and quadrupling or quintupling production from the oil sands over a relatively short period of time. Now, there are major environmental issues in this debate surrounding the extraction of oil from the oil sands. This practice, as you may know, generates 3 times more greenhouse gases than conventional methods, which it will also devastate thousands of square kilometers of land. Moreover, the report recommends that the Canadian and Alberta governments simplify the environmental approval process for these energy products because the clock is ticking for the United States. And this was co-produced by Human Resources Canada. This issue, like all of the SPP issues, must be the subject of a public debate. Now, this meeting of January 2006 is simply a list of showing the powers of large corporations over these issues that are of the utmost importance for the people of the 3 countries involved. We are, to say the least, skeptical with respect to the benefits of this, and the process would seem to be to create a good business community rather than...
Wrap up very quickly, please. You're quite a bit over time now, so...
Well, in conclusion then, what we are asking for is a moratorium on the SPP process until there is full disclosure of all the work that's being done to date under the partnership, that an impact study be conducted, and for there to be a real debate on the issue. We are also calling for a dismantling of the NACC, which is illegitimate. This is an issue of our future, and all citizens in the country are concerned by this and need to have a say in the type of relationships that they want to maintain with people in other countries on this continent. Thank you.
Carleton University, Professor Michael Hart, and he's from the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs. Go ahead, please, Professor Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee and share some of my ideas on the Security and Prosperity Initiative. Let me begin by saying I don't represent anybody. As you know, university professors are a rather contrarian group, and the idea of me representing any one of them would be taken, I think, with some deep offense. So I'm here purely on my own responsibility, expressing my own views, and I think I'm here because I have some background in this, both as a government official and as an academic analyst. So let me comment briefly on the SPP so we can get on with the questions. I think some of the witnesses here are perhaps a little overexcited about the SPP. I think there's not much to it. What it really is a kind of a packaged version of what's going on as part of routine between Canada and the United States. The Canada School of Public Service did an interesting study a few years ago looking at the extent of networks between Canadian and American officials, and they stopped counting when they reached 240. And what do these 240 networks do? They solve problems together. I mean, they recognize the fact that Canadians and Americans have similar kinds of problems, live very closely together, have deeply integrated economies, and so they set up working groups, they set up networks and so on in order to solve those problems. And these go on a regular basis. What the SPP did, and a number of initiatives before that, is take many of these ongoing initiatives and package them together to provide a little bit more political jazz to them, and what's useful to officials in order to provide them with some political leadership. To an official working on a problem, the speed and the intensity with which you address those issues is dependent on the amount of political leadership that you see, the amount of political commitment that you see to a problem. And so what the SPP did was try to raise the profile of some of the work that was going on and give it a little bit more political pizzazz. That's nice. When you look at it, as I've done, the SPP represents the 6th reiteration of that package. There have been a series of such packages going back to 1996, which put together a series of problems dealing with cross-border trade, cross-border investment and so on, which required the attention of officials. So there's really nothing all that new about it. And that's my main complaint about it. That as good as it is, it just isn't good enough. It really doesn't address the real problems that Canada and the United States need to address in the world in which we now live. The biggest problem that I see with it is that it is an initiative that is limited to what can be done by the 3 governments within their existing legislative mandates. There's a commitment that they will not do things that will require them to go to Parliament or to the House of Commons, to Congress, in order to make the kinds of changes. And what that means is that we will have little changes, an incremental approach to problem solving, whereas I think in the world of 9/11 and in the world of deep integration, there are things that need to be done that require the governments to go to Parliament and to go to Congress to seek deep changes. What we need to do is to take the issues that are in this initiative, add some to them, and make them part of an initiative that will lead to a treaty, similar to what was done in the 1980s in negotiating the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, where similarly there were a lot of smaller problems being attended to, and they were finally rolled up into a serious initiative which led to a bilateral treaty. And I think that that needs to be done on the SPP front. Why? Well, because I think there are 3 fundamental problems that need to be addressed by the 2 governments. And I emphasize the 2 governments because I think the issues between Canada and the United States are of a different order than the issues between the United States and Mexico, and there are virtually no issues between Mexico and Canada. So the SPP, in effect, is 2 parallel initiatives that are joined for the convenience of U.S. officials. But I emphasize that we need to concentrate on Canada-U.S. issues, and there are 3. The first is the border. And Ron Lennox has already, I think, given you some pretty good illustrations of the extent to which the border is a problem. If you take into account the depth of integration between our 2 economies, if you take into account the nature of international trade and investment today, the fact that we have the whole just-in-time production system, that we now rely increasingly on what are known as global value chains, where goods and services move back and forth, and different parts of a large network of companies and suppliers integrate that into final products, it is critically important that the border be as open and as unintrusive as possible. And what we have seen since 9/11 is a border that has become more intrusive, as many more things have been loaded onto the border that could be done elsewhere or perhaps not done at all. I think we've reached a stage, for example, where we should stop considering the border to be a revenue-gathering device. I think given the extent of free trade that we have, I remain deeply offended every time I cross the border and I have somebody with a hat and a blue shirt ask me if I bought anything in the United States. Who cares? Given the depth of integration, the amount of harassment of people on that small point raises at most several $1 million and costs more to administer than it does to do anything useful. So I think we should stop thinking of the border as a revenue device. Secondly, the border is used in order to ensure regulatory compliance. On the Canadian side of the border, the Canadian agents there, the immigration and customs officials, are responsible for ensuring compliance with over 100 statutory instruments on behalf of their department and other departments. On the U.S. side, they're responsible for ensuring compliance with 400 statutory instruments. Many of those things companies comply with regardless of whether they're being checked at the border. And so what we should be looking at is what can we move away from the border, what can we get rid of altogether, so that the border can become what it should be, a place where we look after security matters. And even there, I think we would have a more secure border if we had proper police and intelligence cooperation rather than a teenager on a summer job asking whether or not you're going to wish one country or the other harm. I think we need a much different approach to the border. The second issue that we need to look at, and that is related to the fact that we have a border that is used largely to ensure regulatory compliance, is to look at the whole issue of regulatory convergence between Canada and the United States. We have two very similar economies with people who demand very similar things, and as a result we have very similar regulatory regimes in place. But they are sufficiently different to ensure jobs for all kinds of people on both sides of the border, ensuring these tiny little differences. And so I think the time has come for us to move much more expeditiously than is being done under the SPP to reduce those small differences to no differences, and therefore reduce the number of things that need to be done at the border. And in the question period, I'd be happy to elaborate on some of this in more detail. Finally, in order to do that, I think we need to develop a sufficient institutional capacity between Canada and the United States to govern the extent of integration between our two economies. I find it shocking, every time I look at it, that Canada and Europe have a more extensive institutional framework in place to look after that relationship than Canada and the United States do between them. I think the time has come for us to kind of put into the dustbin of history our fear of institutional capacity between our two countries and do what's necessary to ensure that we have the political oversight that this very deep and very important relationship requires. Doing those three things cannot be done on the basis of the kind of initiative that the SPP represents. It must be done at a higher political level, and it requires the kind of bureaucratic and political leadership that is currently lacking. To that end, one final thing, to that end, I would like to see the government establish a Department of North American Affairs to provide leadership over this and drive the agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Professor Hart. We'll go now directly to the questions, starting with the official opposition. Mr. Baines, for 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for coming before the committee. It's nice to see the range of views on this particular discussion that we're having around SPP. As you know, we're trying to study trade and investment between Canada and the United States. And I want to make it clear, I know Mr. Pepin mentioned that the SPP is a treaty. My understanding, it's not a treaty or an accord. I think it was very well described by you, Ms. Healy, as NAFTA Plus. It's kind of an additional framework that works on top of NAFTA to help with integration matters. I think there is a recognition that people have expressed concerns around accountability and transparency, and hence why we're having these meetings. So I think it is a step in the right direction. These are televised meetings, so not only are they exclusively for the members here, but also for the public that has access to television can view these meetings as well. And so I think there's an effort that's being made here to make this as open and public as possible in terms of parliamentarian oversight. But my first question is, I just want to confirm who's been consulted. I know that the Canadian Trucking Alliance has been consulted and has been part of the discussions. Is that correct?
Yeah, sure. I can explain to you a little bit about our involvement. Again, when the SPP was being rolled out, there were discussions between ourselves and various different departments of government. It wasn't just one. We weren't just dealing with customs. We were dealing with transportation. We were dealing with immigration, because they were looking at various different initiatives, and they wanted our perspective on it because they knew that it affected us. This, to me, is normal. This is the way we work every day. I mean, when a government department wants to do something that will affect the trucking industry, it typically will consult us, and the SPP was no different. Our involvement in the North American Competitiveness Council was less so. We're certainly not represented as one of those 30 on the council. But we did have several conversations with the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, who were coordinating Canada's input on that, and had given them several suggestions for what we thought would be appropriate.
Okay. And Ms. Healy, was the Canadian Labour Congress ever involved in any discussion? Was their input ever sought after? Were you ever asked for your input in any capacity?
We've never been invited to participate in any of the working groups. We have, any discussions we have had, we have made inquiries and made our own efforts to have discussions, but we've never been invited.
Okay, so you've made an effort on your end. You've made an effort on your end that you've submitted information. You try to get involved in the process, but there hasn't been that kind of forthcoming on behalf of the process from the SPP and the government. That's right. There's no mechanism for us. And just again, similar question from Mr. Pepin. The same thing with the Quebec Network on Continental Integration. Were you ever involved, or have you ever been asked for your input in any capacity?
Jamais on a été...
No, we were never contacted on the issue. No, all that we know is through the research that we've done. And often, as I said in my presentation, it's documents that we've received under access to information requests. In the United States, we get information on the process that way. Otherwise, we haven't been consulted at all.
Professor, so I can assume that you haven't been consulted directly on this matter.
I have never been formally consulted. Have I been asked questions? Yes, often. Do I have difficulty gaining access to people working on issues that I'm interested in? No. Is there information available that I need on this initiative? Yes. There is an extensive website available which is full of useful information and contacts and so on. So anything that I want to know about the SPP, I can gain access to.
No, I'm glad, because I guess the second line of questioning I had was there's been concerns raised that there's this hidden agenda, or there seems to be a lack of transparency, and especially with respect to North American Competitive Council, that they put forth some results, that they made some recommendations. In your opinion, and I guess Ms. Healy, you mentioned this in your research paper, what specific concerns do you genuinely have that you think that they're trying to hide, or they're trying to avoid public discourse over? Like, what specific concerns do you have about their recommendations or their approach?
Well, our concerns are that when you get into any of the substantive areas of concern, for example, energy, there is a series of objectives that is led by the biggest corporations in this country, and indeed in North America, that is not representing a wider concern of the concerns of society. So, for example, in the hyper-development of the tar sands and the regulatory reform that is related to that, what we see are the interests of large corporations trying to extract resources as quickly as possible without any regard for the environmental impact, which is been mentioned today is quite significant, quite significant, nor for the safety and dignity of workers involved, or for the communities that are experiencing this kind of rapid industrialization.
I guess one of the issues that was brought forth by Mr. Hart as well is a recognition that, and I think you raised a good point, when you cross the border, why do you even ask what I purchased? Because now our economies are so well integrated with NAFTA, and you've indicated in your research paper as well, since 1996 to 2005, we've generated an accumulated surplus of close to $150 billion. It's helped generate many jobs here, especially in Ontario, which is reliant on manufacturing. With the dollar, with the appreciation of the dollar, there is concern that we're losing jobs. So isn't it in our best interest as a country to have strong working relationships with the United States to improve integration and trade? And if there's concerns that you've raised, as you alluded to, with the tar sands or with bulk water diversification, those are genuine concerns. But aside from that, there's many synergies that we need to work on, or there's many areas where we need to work on to help improve trade. And in your opinion, do you feel that the SPP process in general is flawed, or there's specific components that are flawed?
In our understanding of this process and our analysis has led us to the conclusion that the process as a whole needs to be discussed and debated and thought through very carefully. What we see is discussions about reinvestment in infrastructure. So in principle, we are in favor of infrastructure development in Canada. However, we want to see that is governed by the principles of the public economy, that it's related to a generalized economic development project that makes sense for regions in this country, that we don't just build new infrastructure in this country that is meant to receive containers of manufactured goods that are brought into the country. What we want to see is a discussion about what kind of infrastructure, what kind of economy are we building this infrastructure for. We have a manufacturing crisis in Canada. We know that in the United States and in Mexico too, there's very, very serious jobs issues and manufacturing issues that need to be dealt with. And we need to have the kind of discussion which is going to acknowledge the seriousness of the jobs and manufacturing crisis. And we need strategies that are going to develop the resources of communities and of industries.
Thank you, Ms. Healy, and thank you, Mr. Baines. Now to the Bloc Québécois, Monsieur Cardin, for 7 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the committee, and thank you for getting involved in such an important issue as this. From the outset, Mr. Chairman, I do want to share my time with my colleague, because we don't know how the next round will go. Maybe we won't get back to us. But it's clear that the SPP, from what we can see, is something that will jeopardize Canadian sovereignty. And you may find it odd that I'm concerned with Canadian sovereignty, but I am gravely concerned with it. And because without Canadian sovereignty, without Canada's sovereignty in Quebec, we'll have difficulty gaining our own sovereignty. So I think it's important to establish these issues. Now, under the SPP, let me see, what was the date? In March of 2005, there was a meeting. Approaches were established, as were strategies. They focused on quality of life, economic issues, etc. And at the time, it was also said that each country agreed to put together working groups for security and prosperity at the ministerial level that would involve the following process. And it included consulting the business community, consulting, well, that's the reason for this partnership, but also heads of state and municipalities. That's what it said in the document. And NGOs. And the questions put to witnesses earlier showed that if you weren't directly in the business community, you weren't consulted. So we know that the economic issues prevail. So as part of the, well, as part of a consultation, what would you suggest? What do we need to do to put in place an adequate consultation process? And how could you be involved in that?
C'est une très bonne question.
That's an excellent question. Now, what struck us initially was the lack of will to organize the consultations, that broad consultation, the kind that you're talking about. Now, we think it needs to start in Parliament. The gentleman earlier said that these are televised meetings, but this isn't Canadian Idol. people watching this, well, at any rate, there are limited numbers of viewers for this meeting, I would suspect. Now, if there's a debate in Parliament, there's a great likelihood that it'll make the headlines, that people will hear about it. So that's the first point. Now, it should be debated in Parliament. Now, I assume that each will exert pressure on his or her MP to reveal what they know about the SPP. But apart from that, I don't know what we could really propose, because at present, the Minister Bernier, when he tabled the second leader's report, he said, well, now that we've consulted the Canadian Council of Business Executives, we're going to consult others. But they didn't do it, and that dates back to September 2006. Now, we had an information evening. We invited Minister Bernier to come and discuss it with it. It was on March 29th, the date that the SPP was signed. We invited him 4 months ahead of time, but he told us that his schedule was such that it didn't enable him to come and discuss the SPP with us. So, of course, there is no will on the part of the government to do this. Well, my colleague will continue. Well, perhaps along the same lines, I was reading your report with great interest. I went through it quickly because I just received it this morning, but you talk a lot about deeper integration and a neoliberalism phase. Now, you also talked about values in our society that weren't taken into account. Ms. Burrows, you mentioned this. You talked about it being anti-democratic. And I think you stated that very clearly. Because it's a committee that meets behind closed doors. We don't hear about their work. And they have very well-defined objectives. It also affects our environmental policies, our social policies, our health policies. You expressed concerns about that with respect to the issue of harmonizing all of these measures and policies between the United States, Quebec, Canada, and Mexico. Now, this issue of harmonization and harmonizing our policies with those of the U.S. and Mexico, how will that affect our own values as Quebecers and as Canadians? And our social policies, how will that affect us here? Well, of course, there was the issue of sovereignty that was mentioned earlier. One concern that we have is that harmonization means reducing our standards. It means reducing them because we know, for example, that in Canada and in Quebec, we have social policies, whether it be with respect to the environment, health, etc., and they're very different from those that exist in the United States. Let's not fool ourselves. We're not as powerful in North America than our neighbors to the south are. So it's that concern that we're going to have to adopt American policies. And the issue of security as well is another one in terms of vision to get involved in this war on terrorism. But that's really a major concern in the United States, and we're being forced to make all kinds of changes to our legislation and our policies to respond to requirements in a third country, in another country that's not based on our vision. Well, our business leaders often have interests in the United States and the U.S., so...
Please.
Non, mais j'allais juste dire aussi, je pense que...
Well, I was just going to say that I think it's important to consult civil society as well, because earlier on we talked about the importance of this debate taking place in the House of Commons, a public debate, and you need to consult civil society organizations as well, because we find it strange that the Canadian business leaders have direct access to parliamentarians, and people, civil society groups that represent the people, haven't had an opportunity to speak.
Government side for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm always amazed how the war in Iraq gets brought into talking about a security and prosperity agreement here in Canada and how we can move the goods and services across the borders a little bit easier. I just have a couple I got enough to ask questions for about 20 minutes, but I only have 7 minutes. We're going to try and make this go as quick as possible. Mr. Hart, how long were you with DFATE, or what's your history with foreign affairs and trade?
I was a government civil servant for 22 years, most of that in DFATE, most of it concentrated on trade negotiations.
Great. And what was your, I'm assuming then, or would it be fair to say, you're involved with NAFTA then? What was your involvement with NAFTA? Did you?
I did all the preparatory work for the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement and was part of that team. I advised the NAFTA team, but I had other responsibilities at that time.
Okay. Is it? It's been alluded to here by certain groups that bulk water is included in NAFTA. Is that true? Thank you. Wow.
Everybody's leaving.
Everyone's gone. What's going on here? Anyways, I guess my question is, the concern I have, we talk about prosperity all the time, is that, you know, most businesses in Canada are small businesses, and I want to talk again to Mr. Hart and Mr. Lennox about what this, I mean, goods and services going across the border, and I guess we hear constantly from the NDP that we've got a prosperity gap, there are things that are happening, but I don't know where we're going to do trade if we're not able to get our goods and services across the borders. Mr. Hart, can you talk just a bit about, a bit more to us about the process of trying to, you know, streamline the borders and move through? You talked about a couple things regarding regulations that would make some sense as we move forward.
Stats Canada did a study a few years ago where they counted the number of Canadian firms that are engaged in exporting. And they counted somewhere like 42,000 of them, of whom about 35,000 do trade with the United States. So then we have 35,000 companies in Canada. So it's not just large corporations, it is quite a large range of corporations that are engaged in this kind of trade. And the kind of trade they're now engaged in is what economists are now calling integrative trade. That is, they are participating in the making of things. An economist, Stephen Blank at Pace University in New York, says that Canada and the United States no longer trade with each other. What we do is we build things together. And given the fact that we build things together, the fact that there's a border in between the two parties who are building things together is a potential disincentive to investment in Canada. If you are an investor looking for a new opportunity or to expand an existing opportunity, one of the things you're going to look at is what kind of problems am I going to have at the border? And if you think you're going to have problems, you say, well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to locate in the big market and export what I need to the small market rather than locate in the small market and face the hassle of 90% of your goods that need to go into the network that's in the United States having to cross that border. So I think that it is a very legitimate and very important objective for Canada to see what's being done at the border, what can we do to reduce the disincentives that the border creates. And I give the Canadian Border Services Agency and the Government of Canada full marks for having done as much as they can on a unilateral basis. I mean, we have done a tremendous amount in streamlining what we do, in putting in place programs which use electronics, which use pre-clearance and so on, which move things away from the border. I think that we cannot do much more unless we do it together. And so the main objective that we should be pursuing is what can we do together with the Americans. Now, in order to do it with the Americans are not preoccupied by the border as a revenue issue, as an economic issue. They are preoccupied with the border now as a security matter. And so that's why the two are so much tied together. You cannot build a more open border, which I think is what we need, unless you enhance the confidence that the Americans have in Canada as a security partner. And that's why I think it is important that this is tied together, but that's why it's also important that we work with the Americans in enhancing their confidence in us as a security partner so that we can reduce the amount of things that the Americans feel they must do at the border.
Mr. Lennox, one of the questions I have is we keep talking, referring to big business, big business. You know, I've got a guy in my riding, his name's Ken Westerhoff, he owns Cedar Way Floral. And he has fresh cut flowers that he tries to get across the border. He is not big business. And I assure you that if his truck gets stopped at the border for any reason, any excuse, those are perishable items that cannot be used tomorrow. It's not some kind of freight he can do it. And we could talk about just-in-time inventory or anything else. Talk to us about the importance of pre-clearance programs and why and how we need to make this thing work better.
Well, you're absolutely right. The trucking industry isn't different than a lot of other Canadian industries in that it is primarily made up of small businesses. There are over 10,000 carriers in this country. There's a handful of large ones and a lot of very small ones. But it's fundamentally important that those guys are able to cross the border without delay. Again, we operate, as Professor Hart indicated, in a just-in-time environment. A truck at a standstill makes no revenue for the carrier, and the driver probably isn't making anything if he's held up at the border. And, of course, you run into issues such as you indicated on perishable products. As I mentioned in my Mr. Bradley's prepared remarks, we hold out some considerable hope that through harmonized pre-clearance processes, the situation at the border will get better. It's kind of, you know, I use this term all the time, but it's kind of nuts and bolts things. But the U.S. has developed what they call an automated truck manifest. Okay, we provide information in advance, certain data elements, cargo, crew, conveyance information in advance electronically. It's mandatory at certain locations at the U.S. land border, and it will be at all locations at the U.S. land border by the end of this year. Canada is just embarking on a similar process. It's referred to as ACI, Automated Commercial Information, I believe that stands for. There's a commitment in SPP to harmonize those two processes, so truck drivers or trucking companies are not building different systems depending on which way the data is going. It's extremely important for us. We are involved in a consultative process that has been established by the Canada Border Services Agency and in fact includes representatives from U.S. Customs. Business groups of all kinds are part of that consultative process. It's one of our top priorities right now.
Mr. Allison, you have time for one more short question if you'd like.
I just, Mr. Hart, again, back to you in terms of, you talked about dual regulatory. I mean, there's regulations on the Canadian side and the American side. Doesn't mean that they need to be harmonized necessarily because there's different regulatory processes. Do you want to just comment quickly on that?
There are quite a number of ways in which you can achieve regulatory convergence, which is a word that I like better than harmonization. You can have mutual recognition agreements. You can agree on a certain set of standards and leave it up to the individual country or industry and so on how you implement that. What we need to do is get rid of those differences that are really quite small and develop cooperative approaches to achieving the same regulatory outcomes. And in most cases, both countries want the same regulatory outcomes. So why not cooperate?
Thank you very much, Mr. Allison. Now to the Democratic Party, Mr. Julian for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to each of you for coming here today. What the testimony has very clearly indicated is that this issue, this agenda, goes far beyond smart borders. But I was interested in your commentary, Mr. Lennox, that even on the Smart Borders Initiative, which is a tiny portion of the overall SPP agenda, the government has manifestly failed on moving forward even that component. That's an interesting point that I hope we can come back to. But I'd like to touch on the issue of prosperity, and I'd like to ask you, Dr. Healy, as well as Mr. Pepin and Madame Bureaus, this is something that government spokespeople continually talk about, that somehow the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement has succeeded enormously, NAFTA's succeeded enormously, and that somehow the SPP more of the same medicine is going to increase Canada's prosperity. But StatsCan belies that myth. The StatsCan points out very clearly that since 1989, since the signing of the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, for most Canadian families, they're actually earning less in real terms than they were back in 1989. I mean, there's no clear manifestation of failure on economic and trade policy than the fact that poorest Canadians have actually lost a month's income in real terms, that the working class Canadians and middle class Canadians have each lost on average about 2 weeks of salary in real terms. Even upper middle class Canadians have had absolutely no progress on the economic front, and those that have profited from the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement and from NAFTA are the wealthiest of Canadians. They're making money hand over fist. Most Canadian families are actually earning less. What a failure on the bottom line of trade and economic policy. So my question to all three of you is, how do we address this issue of prosperity? And really, what is this agenda all about? If the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA have failed on the prosperity front, delivering prosperity to most Canadians, then what is this agenda really about, in your opinion? Alors, si vous pouvez répondre aussi après.
So if you'd like to answer as well after Dr. Healy.
I think that what we see here is that not only have families lost ground, but there's been a widening disparity of income and wealth. And there are people who are benefiting. There are corporations who are benefiting. Profits have been very high in these years, but that doesn't mean that the interests of the profit-making corporations are directly translated into the experience of families across the country. And I think when we look at different segments of our society, those who have been put in the most vulnerable positions, then we can even see even more clearly where this is headed. I think we need to have a wide-ranging discussion about the structure of our economy and the kind of economy that we see for the future that we need, and the kind of economy that seems to be unfolding in front of us. What's happening with manufacturing? What's happening with jobs in this country? There's a serious crisis going on. We're losing ground, and we're returning to becoming exporters once again of unprocessed raw materials. And that is a strategy that is very short-sighted. Sure, it'll put a lot of money in the pockets of a small number of corporations, but what does that do for economic development across the country more generally? And I want to keep coming back to the implications and the way as a working class organization we see the effects on transportation workers. We see the racial profiling that is also a part of the story that Mr. Lennox has shared with us about problems with the border. There's issues here for workers in general, and also problems that immigrant workers are facing. Look at the ITAR story that we heard about a few weeks ago. So maybe I'll let others.
Well, when we talk about prosperity or social inequality that has increased over the years with free trade, now with NAFTA and NAFTA Plus, I think it's important to point out the impact on women who are often at the bottom of the ladder in unstable jobs, atypical types of work that's even more unstable now. So this is a snapshot of the situation of how people are worse off than before. Women are in that category. I think it's also important to focus on discrimination based on ethnocultural factors. Because the pay scale, what we have at the bottom are visible minorities, women, then immigrant families, other women, men, visible minorities, then other immigrants and other men. So it's important to take into account that hierarchy that exists in our society today. And NAFTA Plus is simply, with the SPP, placing greater emphasis on deregulation with a view to harmonizing measures with the United States. And I think that's going to exacerbate the situation even more. Thank you.
Regulatory framework, which means basically protections for Canadian families. And there is a strong push in, we've heard in testimony from government spokespeople, they always say, well, all the information's out there, which is false, as we know. And they also say, oh, there's no problem with harmonization. But we know in the United States the regulatory process is flawed. We saw that with bovine growth hormone. We've seen that with a number of scandals in the pharmaceutical industry and issues around food safety. So what would Canadian families be giving up in terms of those fundamental protections to know that your food, pharmacy products, pharmaceutical products, that those kinds of things, those protections are in place? What do we give up if we simply, as with the softwood lumber agreement, simply concede everything to basically making sure those decisions are made in Washington rather than made here in Canada by Canadians?
Well, I think that there are people who look at the regulatory question and say that what we need is regulatory diversity, not regulatory. We don't need downward harmonization of regulations. We need the kind of regulatory perspective which deals with the needs of families, which deals with the needs of communities. This kind of regulatory harmonization and a movement towards the bottom is something that we have to fight back against, but we can't if we're not given the information about what kind of regulations or what is the process for engagement on this question. If we only have employers and corporations who say, well, we know all about these sectors, so we'll give the government advice. Well, you know, there are other people involved in civil society and in the economy more generally who also have an experience of regulations. For example, port workers were very active on these discussions around security and regulatory reform in the ports, and had they not been there to respond to the issues, the regulatory reforms for port workers would have been even more onerous, you know, and I think what we need to see is a broad-ranging kind of discussion about regulatory reform. It has to be
Ms. Healy,
democratized.
excuse me, your time is more than up. Mr. Julian, thank you. We now go to the 5-minute round. Mr. Maloney from the official opposition. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hart, you indicated that certainly the border is one of the fundamental problems that we have to change. But certainly vis-a-vis the United States, it is a security issue, and I agree with you. But how do we change that mindset? We heard from Mr. Lennox. He's the fellow who represents the people who are on the ground, who are trying to cross that border. You indicated there were roughly 100 regulatory problems on the Canadian side, 400 on the U.S. side. I'm not sure that the U.S. really wants to dance. They say they do, but from time to time, all these barriers that go up. Mention was made of oranges and roast beef sandwiches going in a trucker's lunch. Every time you turn around, there seems to be more security investigations which overlap. How do we change the mindset in the United States? How do we impress upon them that Canada is the largest trading partner for many, many U.S. states?
Well, you don't do it on the basis of an incremental approach that largely puts civil servants together to talk about problems that they're experiencing. I mean, that does some good, but it really isn't going to change the fundamentals. In order to change the fundamentals, you have to capture imagination in Washington. And in order to capture imagination in Washington, you have to have a big initiative. The nature of the U.S. decision-making process, where power is widely dispersed and there are a lot of people who have a role in it, is that you must think big. And if you have a big initiative, then you can get Americans excited about it and move the agenda forward. We did that with the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. The Mexicans did it with the NAFTA. There have been similar kinds of initiatives. You can go back to earlier eras, the NATO and the NORAD and so on, were major initiatives which captured imagination in the United States and overcame the multitude of smaller interests in the United States that are always ready to point out, well, if you do this, I will be affected. And so if you think big, you can overcome that. Do I think that, that if we do that, we can then overcome the many problems that we have on the security front? No. But I think that that's where we have to start. We have to build a higher level of concern in Washington at the highest levels that the continued health and prosperity of the North American economy means that we must deal with the border differently. That means a willingness on our part to, for example, strengthen the perimeter around North America in order to deal with security issues that are uppermost in American minds and should also be of concern to us. And similarly, we need to be prepared to sit down with the Americans and be good partners. I think over the last 10 or so years, we have not been as good a partner as we might have been, raising suspicion in Washington as to whether or not we will continue to be the kind of partner that they're looking for. And so in the end, these are political choices. You make the political choices and you reap the results. We have made a political choice that we wanted a more deeply integrated North American economy. We have benefited greatly from that, despite what some of the witnesses are saying. We must now decide whether we want to make that work, or do we want to put various kinds of obstacles in its way, including allowing the Americans to build up the security framework that they're pursuing.
Ms. Healy, we're concerned about jobs for the people that you advocate for. and you've heard Mr. Hart respond to my questions. On your half, we need to open up our borders, but you're concerned about more on sovereignty issues, about visa information sharing, situations like this that may assist in appeasing the fears of the U.S. on our security. How do we reconcile that?
Excuse me. Well, to this point, I don't think that we've been successful in appeasing the fears of the United States security concerns. I think that these are ongoing issues, as we've heard in the trucking industry and in the border. The whole security question is one that is being integrated with the economic question. And I think that what we have to do is come up with a fundamentally different way, and we have to interject a new way of thinking about these relationships, which does not build ever increasingly upon a climate of fear and distrust. I think that there are issues around human rights that need to be discussed in relation to this question of security. And I'd like to know what mechanism there is for us having this discussion about human rights in the SPP. And I think that the more open and transparent and inclusive this discussion, the more likely it is that we're going to find solutions to it. You know, we have reports, there are these meetings that we keep hearing about, maybe even after the fact or at the moment before they happen, this North American 2025 meeting or a series of meetings that are going on, the famous, infamous Banff meeting. We hear from one of the press, the person who was in charge of keeping the press and public away from the meeting, saying that, no, these meetings are not secret, they're private. And we want to know, why can't we have the information about what MPs presented at these meetings, or what MPs
Ms. Healy,
said at these
I have
meetings?
to interrupt you at this point. Mr. Maloney's time is long past. Should be careful in the way I word that. Could we go to the Bloc Québécois, to Monsieur André for 5 minutes?
Well, I'll share my time with Mr. Cardin. I have a question for Mr. Hart. Now, you're a professor of trade policy. Canada is currently going to great lengths to attempt to satisfy the U.S. by enhancing border security following 9/11. Now, you also said that there are negotiations underway with the U.S. in order to find ways of improving border security, etc. But I'm concerned with this issue. Just how far are we going to go down that road in terms of improving security? And if, for example, there were a situation, an act of terrorism, with someone crossing our border, look at all the consequences that there would have, economic consequences, because it is possible, even if we are enhancing border security, if we're taking great steps, there still could be terrorists who may cross the border and commit an act of terrorism and come back to Canada. That is possible. And I assume that there would be another major economic impact, more consequences. Now, are these things that you've looked at? And secondly, when you say that we haven't always been a good partner, Canada with the United States, that leads me to think that we are under the influence of the United States, their military approach. We're investing in the military to a larger degree now, and with this new government. Then there's the environmental policy in order to export our oil sands, rather. There are It talks about continuing to develop the oil sands, not respecting Kyoto, but to enhance development. But we did provide $1 billion from our industry in order to reach the softwood lumber agreement. So I'd like to hear you respond to those comments, please.
Figure out where you want me to start. I mean, how far do we need to go? Well, Canada and the United States have a very long history of working together to resolve problems. I mean, going back to the 1935 trade agreement, where we first agreed that we would treat each other as best partners rather than worst partners, which was the case before that, through NORAD, NATO, and a whole host of agreements. We have over 350 bilateral treaties in place between Canada and the United States right now, indicating the extent of cooperation between us. But given the nature of our interdependence, both on the economic and the security front, the job is never done. There's always a new frontier to cross, a new opportunity to seize, a new way of looking at things. And in order to do that, I think we have to be conscious of the fact that the United States is our most important partner, whether we want them to be or not. And I think that's a very Canadian way of putting it. Because the Americans do live next door. They are a global power. We are not a global power, but we do have a high level of economic and security interdependence with the United States. For instance, on the security front, the idea of ensuring our security on anything other than a bilateral basis is just not possible. Canada doesn't have the resources required in order to ensure our security. We must do it on a bilateral basis. And so since the 1939 agreement between the Roosevelt and King administration, we have done it on a bilateral cooperative basis, and we both benefited from that. And so the idea that we can go our own way, I think, is a ludicrous idea in the Canadian context. And so it's in that kind of perspective that we say to the Americans, we want to be your partner. We want to be a reliable partner. You can count on us. And on that basis, let's solve a few problems that we have on the security front. And that's the only way we're going to be able to do that.
Well, you said that we were a bad partner, that we haven't been a good partner in recent years. If it's from that perspective, I'd like to hear some examples. What do you mean by Canada not being a good partner? I don't necessarily agree with it.
Please, a very short response for Mr. Andre is out of time, so very short response.
I mean, over the last 10 years, the relationship at the top between our two governments has not been as productive and as reliable as it could have been. There have been many times when I think the government moved in a direction that I thought was unhelpful to building a secure, reliable partnership.
Thank you, Mr. Andre. Now to the government side, to Mr. Cannon for 5 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the witnesses. I just want to thank you for your presentation. Specifically, Ms. Healy, you started off and you asked in your preamble who the SPP is for. And I look around the table, and we've been debating this issue for several meetings and have several discussions over the last few months on where our international trade strategy should be. And I believe everyone around the table, especially when it comes to equality, and we all have access to opportunity to increase our our quality of life and find ways in which we can ensure opportunities for all Canadians. And I think that's a goal that we all can agree on, no matter what political stripe you're from. And I look at North American opportunities. As I said, we've had several witnesses said this is where we should be focusing our energies, and our biggest trading partners, over $2 billion of trade a day going across the border, 37,000 trucks. There's approximately 80% of our population live within 160 kilometers of the border. An average Canadian family who rely on small businesses, and my riding in the interior of British Columbia and all of us around the table, we need to ensure that we have this streamlining of a border, seamless border crossing, as seamless as possible. So I would like to ask Mr. Lennox in a moment, but I just want to clarify one other statement that was made about where Canadian families sit in the past with NAFTA and where we're heading in the future. And Mr. Julian had stated about Canadian families and how poor off they were, but the fact is Canadian families in the whole experienced two periods in which income fell, one in early 1980s and one in early 1990s. In both cases, the Canadian economy was in a recession. So you can go through the statistics and manipulate them however you want. If you use the benchmark of 97 or 2004, I can massage and show you all kinds of numbers. Professor Hart can probably do it extremely better than all of us around the table. But the fact is that when it comes to NAFTA, we're a lot better off as Canadians and North Americans and all three of our trading partners because of the trade that's been generated and the business opportunities. So I just need to clarify that and get it on the record. But specifically, Mr. Lennox, my uncle has a trucking company. I used to work for him in Alberta, bringing produce through Mexico and California, through Western Canada. I know the importance of having, the delays at the border. Many times the truckers calling, that's a day at the border costs tens of thousands of dollars for your members. Can you maybe clarify or expand a little bit if you've had any opportunity to participate in the e-manifest program and the pre-clearance and what it'll do for helping your clients and your moving goods and services across the border?
Yeah, certainly. In terms of the process itself, this e-manifest process in the U.S. has been underway for quite some time now. A government industry advisory group called the Trade Support Network was struck in the United States. Representatives from all modes of transportation, as well as brokers and shippers and so forth, were part of that process. I was personally part of that process and remain involved. And the idea there was to ensure that the system to convey manifest data that the United States uses to make risk decisions on the carrier and on the driver, for example, and on the cargo are there in advance, and that the risk screening is done before the truck gets to the border. Now, in Canada, as I said, we're just embarking on that process. The first meeting, it was a government industry consultative process. The first meeting of the, I believe it's called the ACI group, met in Ottawa in January of this year. They're talking about doing a very similar process. And in fact, the first meeting of the steering committee for that group is taking place this afternoon.
Thank you very much. And one comment, I still have another minute there, to Professor Craig. And I know that there are some concerns about the open, transparent process. I know the previous government had established the process, and our government's trying to make it as open as possible, and that's one of the ways of this meeting. And you referred to the NACC. This is the report here. It's a public document. It's available on the web. If you'd like a copy, I'd be more than willing to provide it for you. This information, there's a web page as well for the government, so it's a full process that's open. Maybe, Mr. Craig, you could elaborate a little bit more as far as your understanding of how the public can be involved in the process from your experience.
As an official, I was part of the group of people who was charged with designing ways and means in which the government can be more open, and I learned something from that process. There are two ways in which you consult. One is you consult in order to improve your technical base, the knowledge that you need in order to move forward. These are consultations on how. And civil servants are very well equipped to do that. There's another kind of consultations which is based on should you do it, the why. Civil servants can't do that. Only politicians can do that. That's a political question, and that must be addressed by either the minister or by parliamentarians. I think that sometimes civil society groups confuse the two kinds of consultations, the how and the why consultations, and they are not the same, and the same people cannot pursue both of them.
Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you, Mr. Cannon. For the final questioner in the 5-minute round, Mr. Julian for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate you saying that, Mr. Hart, that essentially the government has the responsibility to be consulting with the public, and that's something certainly that's come out of these brief hearings. Hopefully government members will understand that they need to open up this process so we can have debates over each and every one of these initiatives. I'd like to come back to you, Dr. Healy, as well as you, Mr. Pepin, Madame Burrows, on the two elements that are fundamental to this. One is the issue around what we believe as a country, the direction we should be going, and how this initiative has been essentially kept away from the public domain so we can have these public discussions. What should the government be doing to ensure that we have those full public consultations so that Canadians can be assured that if we head down this road, it's a road that Canadians agree with? Now, we know that part of the strategy, because we've heard from the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, is to keep it away from the public debate, because they say that there's no appetite for a big debate now. And I think they're seizing on the fact that the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement debate that we had in 1988, aside from the electoral system going against us, essentially most Canadians voted against that agreement. And given the fact that most Canadian families are poor since, despite the government's protestations to the contrary, shows that Canadians were right to be concerned. NAFTA had a similar debate, and most Canadians voted against NAFTA because the Jean Chrétien government had promised to not put it into effect. So how do we get that democracy back so that Canadians are actually being consulted on these issues?
I think, first of all, the government should not hide behind a process of regulatory reform. Basically, this should be a process in which full, open, democratic debate and discussion should occur and should happen in Parliament. I think that parliamentarians should take back their place in this process. I do not think that it should be left to secret meetings, private consultations with the most powerful interests in the country. I think that the representatives of every single community across this country should have the opportunity, and they do bear the responsibility for bringing this discussion even more into the open. I think it's wonderful that we're here today at this committee. I think that this process should be expanded and increased so that there is a full debate, full democratic debate in this country about what seems to be so innocuous as regulatory reform, which in fact, as we have found out through our studies and through hearing from our members and our affiliates, that it is certainly not an innocuous process.
Monsieur Pépin, Madame Burroughs.
Je répéterai à peu près la même chose en français, mais je vais m'abstenir.
Well, I could repeat those comments but before a debate, everyone needs to have the information. Now, we've done research, in-depth research, to come up with information that was available, but it needs to be more easily accessible. Of course, this gentleman identified the report available on the internet, the NACC report, but it was made available on the 24th of February. However, the meeting was announced a week prior to that by the government, and officials in government, they weren't even prepared to meet after the meeting. So these are the issues that need to be raised. We're not just talking about the major negotiations, there are also working groups that are as I mentioned, 9 for security, 10 for prosperity. What are they discussing? We need to have access to that information before we get involved in the broader debate. And yes, it absolutely needs to go through the House of Commons. Absolutely. There's no other option. Well, I would just like to add that when Professor Hart says that we're confusing the two levels of consultation, no, what we're doing, or what the government is saying, don't worry, they're just little minor consultations, technical adjustments. But we want all politicians to debate this and why we should proceed with it. That's what we want. So we agree that, yes, in the House of Commons, the hows and whys should be debated. The why and how we should proceed needs to be debated in the House of Commons, and then the how should be worked out in the details. So the process is exactly the opposite. We need to stop the process, start over, ask the real issue, put the real questions out there, and that should be done in the House of Commons and not at the Chamber of Commerce.
Okay, Mr. Julian, your time is up. We will now go to the next round of questioning. Although the member who would, Monsieur Cardin.
Monsieur President.
Well, Mr. Chairman, we have gone through 2 complete rounds of questioning, we should perhaps then move to the motion that's on the agenda. The motion being moved by the Bloc Québécois, because we need, we've got about 12 minutes left.
So what I'll do is dismiss the witnesses, and then we'll just take a suspend for 2 minutes and go in camera and carry on. Thank you all very much for coming today. It was another very informative meeting. Yes, Mr.
Why are we going in camera?
We've always, Mr. Cannon, we've always gone in camera to deal with committee business. It's been routine. We've always done it. It's normal procedure of the committee. The committee could make a decision on that, certainly. But first, before we, if it is something, I'll give you a chance to bring it up, Mr. Cannon. If you want to bring it up right now, I guess, before we go in camera.
I would move that we don't go in camera.
You've heard Mr. Cannon has moved that we don't move the meeting to an in-camera meeting. Is there any discussion on that? Mr. Julian.
This is going to surprise Mr. Cannon, but I second his motion. This is a public meeting. This is a public motion. It should be discussed in public.
Okay. Any other discussion on the motion? We'll go to a vote on the motion then. Those in favor of the motion? Those opposed? The motion's carried, so we won't go in camera. We will carry on the business in public. I am just going to suspend for 1 minute, just so the witnesses can clear, and then we'll come back and deal with the motion. We reconvene the meeting now. I want to remind all members that we are going to end the meeting on time. Monsieur Cardin, if you would like to read your motion and comment on it, and we'll carry on from there.
Well, Mr. Chairman, of course, this has been done within the 48-hour period. This notice of motion was provided according to our procedures. If you'd like me to read it, I will do so. In light of the discussions on water, and with respect to comments by the Conservatives on protection of water, I will now proceed to read the motion. Whereas Canada's water resources must be protected, whereas NAFTA covers all services and all goods except those that are expressly excluded, and water has not been expressly excluded, whereas this situation of federal responsibility puts the provincial laws prohibiting bulk water exports at risk, whereas a simple agreement by exchange of letters among the governments of Canada, the United States, and Mexico must be respected by international tribunals as if it were an integral part of NAFTA. It is therefore moved that, pursuant to Section 108(2) of the regulations, the Standing Committee recommend that the government quickly begin talks with its American and Mexican counterparts to exclude water from the goods covered by NAFTA, and that the adoption of this motion be adopted to the House as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you very much, Monsieur Cardin. Have you got any comments you'd like to make on your motion?
No, Monsieur le Président, je pense que c'est...
Mr. Chairman, I think it's very clear. And I think that we can move ahead with it quickly.
Mr. Julian, then Mr. Cannon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an excellent motion being brought forth by the Bloc Québécois. I will be supporting this excellent motion from Mr. Cardin. There are some clarifications, however, that I would want to propose as friendly amendments. First of all, in the third paragraph, whereas this situation, I think I want to strike of federal responsibility, and I'll give a copy to the clerk once I've finished my proposal. And again, in that same paragraph, so it would read, whereas this situation puts the provincial and federal laws prohibiting bulk water exports at risk. So I would add and federal before the word laws. In the fourth paragraph on the third line, the change does not affect the English. And then in the actual motion itself, pursuant to Section 1082 of the Standing Orders of the House of Commons. And then to exclude water from the scope of NAFTA. So those would be the 5 clarifications. I will now give the clerk a copy of my proposals.
Okay, Mr. Julian, and we will have the clerk read the motion with the amendments in. There are a lot of amendments there, and then we'll have discussion on the amendments.
Should I only read the changes?
Well,
all of it?
I think it's going to be very difficult for members to understand what's happened here if we don't lay it all out. So.
Right. Attendu que les ressources en eau.
Whereas Canada's water resources must be protected, whereas NAFTA covers all services and all goods except those that are expressly excluded, and that water is not excluded, whereas this situation puts the provincial and federal laws concerning water and including prohibiting bulk water exports at risk. Whereas a simple agreement by exchange of letters among the governments of Canada, the United States, and Mexico, clarifying that water is not covered by NAFTA, must be respected by international tribunals as if it were an integral part of NAFTA. It is moved that, pursuant to Section 1082 of the Standing Orders of the House of Commons, the Standing Committee recommend that the government quickly begin talks with its American and Mexican counterparts to exclude water from the scope of NAFTA, and that adoption of this motion and the preamble be reported to the House as soon as possible.
Members heard the amendments that have been proposed. Mr. Cardin. Then we'll go to Mr. Cannon.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chairman.
Unless you have something else.
Mr. Chairman. I agree with the amendments, so we can proceed.
On the amendment, go ahead, Mr. Cannon. Then Mr. Lemieux.
I just wanted to clarify then, you're removing the word federal responsibility out of the equation. It's just said, whereas the situation puts the provincial laws?
Provincial et fédéral.
Provincial and federal, so adding and federal.
Treaty Act, the province cannot export bulk water. So my question to the clerk then, if it's in fact inaccurate, is a motion in order? If it's factually incorrect.
The committee's present. It's illegal. It's illegal.
Yes, Mr. Cannon. In response to your question, the committee. It's certainly my responsibility as chair, and with advice from the clerk, to ensure that the process is we follow the accuracy of motions. Certainly isn't something that we can eliminate. It's up to the committee to decide on what they want to pass at the committee and put before the House.
In good conscience, knowing that it's illegal, it's not proper to support something that's contravening a treaty act that's already in place. So I won't be supporting.
have to convince the committee members, of course, that that's the case. Mr. Lemieux.
A point I'd like to bring up is that that's quite an amendment. It's very hard to follow. And I'd like to have it in front of me, actually. I'd like to think all members should, no, not just me, I think all members should have it in front of them so we can understand what the amendment is, what the impact is on the motion, and then we can have a proper debate on it. Right. Otherwise, we're going to be questioning, well, what was that part again? I couldn't quite follow the fourth part of that amendment. Yeah. So I'd like to have it in front of me.
Produce amendments.
Sorry.
We do that in bills. It's a
Et en français. Oui, en anglais, en français.
Both English and French, because we speak both languages here.
You feel that you're not, it's not perfectly clear to you all of the amendments that have been made here, and you'd like to see them in front of you. Yeah. So we'll arrange that. Just hold on a minute here. Remind the committee that we have about a minute left. Okay, it sounds like all the members, certainly on the government side, want copies of the changes made to the amendment, and that's certainly reasonable. We'll try to accommodate that. Monsieur Cardin.
Monsieur le Président.
Well, Mr. Chairman, as I mentioned in presenting this motion, it was presented 48 hours ago, even more than that. Copies were provided to all members, and therefore members should be familiar with it, and the proposed changes by Mr. Julian are not major. It doesn't change the essence itself of the motion. So it adjusts, if you will, the presentation of the motion. It adds some clarification, but it does not fundamentally change the substance of the motion. Therefore, the government members are more than familiar with the motion.
Mr. Cardin, I want to make it clear that I'm not ruling the motion out of order. I do, however, there were something, I think, 3 or 4 changes made to your motion. It would have been very helpful to have had those changes prepared ahead of time if you knew this was going to happen, or Mr. Julian, I guess I should be directing that at, so we can have copies for all the members. The members have indicated that they're not comfortable in not having those changes, and we're out of time for today. We're going to have to come back to this at the next meeting, and certainly if we could have those the motion, Mr. Julian, the amendments brought to the committee, that would be extremely helpful. Monsieur Andre,
Monsieur le Président, j'aimerais proposer une motion.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would like to move a motion to extend the meeting by an additional 10 minutes, and I second the motion, says Mr. Julien.
I indicated that we are going to end on time, and we will, and we will start on time next time, and we'll end on time at the next meeting too. So meeting adjourned.
Monsieur le Président,